I'll do that like last time for the announcement. All right, how are we doing on time? We don't do any chats, and some have polls as well. So we're aware of what's going on. We're logged in here and then decide questions that we want to announce to the group. We have to anything that comes in from there or somebody who wants to but I don't want to make her work too hard. And then just so that you that'll be at the end. Say it again? Yeah, we start at 1:45. She said so. I'll make the announcements. Hello, everyone. Our session is about to begin. I just want to let you know if anybody has a need for closed captioning, I have a QR code here, and you're welcome to come on over to the table to scan it in case you need it. But other than that, I would like to welcome our presenter.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Gosh, it's a full house. If you can find room, please come in. There's a few extra chairs up here towards the front. Thank you for coming this afternoon. My name is Kimee Wind-Hummingbird. I'm Muskogee, and I work for the National Native Children's Trauma Center. I've been there for about a year and a half now, but prior to that, I worked for more than 22 years in Indian child welfare. So that's all I've done. My entire professional career is work within tribal communities, keeping them connected to, first and foremost, themselves, and then their communities and their culture. So again, thanks for joining us today. So we'll go ahead and get started. So we're presenting today as a part of the National Children's Advocacy Resource Center, and we are an extension of the National Native Children's Trauma Center. We provide training and technical assistance across the United States and across Indian country to support tribal communities and their partners, their CAC partners, the tribal CACs, and then those other non-tribal CACs. And it's so good to see some of those familiar faces in the room. We're funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. We also have an app. If you guys would like to scan or get our app in the App Store, we have a lot of training and TTA that we provide across the nation. Of course, we're federally funded, so we have the opportunity to come to your area, your neck of the woods, at any time. We have a great team at the center, and we do a lot of trainings across the United States, and I've done some work in British Columbia too. So it's a great organization. We've got a long list of the training and TA that we can provide. We also provide resources there. There have been a number of you guys in the room that have done some moderated panels for us, and they're up on our website as well too. So anyone can tap into those and see what the CACs look like in their communities. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to learn about multidisciplinary teams. And I want to apologize in advance. Like I said, I'm from Oklahoma, and my sinuses and the allergies here have just, I heard you sneezing earlier, bless your heart. It's been like that for me all day too. So I'm a little bit sneezy. So we're going to talk about what an MDT is, and we're going to learn how to cultivate and grow a trauma-informed MDT team. We need to recognize areas in which MDTs can be beneficial to your community. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about historical trauma and the effects that they continue to have on our communities today, and the importance of working or leading with that knowledge, the trauma-informed knowledge that we have to acknowledge and move forward before we can start to heal, our families can start to heal. And then we also are going to hope to learn to understand ways in which an MDT may reflect the culture of the community or the families being served. So, what is an MDT? Does anybody have any thoughts? I know you're like, yes, right. So it's a coordinated response, and I know we've talked a lot about coordinated responses to allegations of child abuse or neglect, and it involves the investigation. And also, in order to have a solid MDT team, you need to have policy, right? You need to have an understanding of practice across the board to know what the team's roles are and what each member's role is on the team. And it revolves around the treatment of the victims and families, and to ensure a successful conclusion to the investigation, because at the end of the day, we're about serving those families, right? We want to make sure that we're providing them, surrounding them with the best services possible. So here are some benefits of an MDT. Would you like, oh, okay, I'm just going to give you a chair. So some of the benefits include better decision making, right? Sometimes I've sat in those chairs where it's like you feel like all the pressure is on you to make a decision as to the best interest of a child or what's right in a family's life. Whenever you have a team together, working together to come up with a plan to best support that family, that's best practice, right? It's about breaking down, we'll talk about that as we go along, but breaking down those cylinders of excellence to acknowledge that, hey, I may not have all the skill set that I need, but I know that my friend across the table does, and it's about us working together to help this family. And MDTs, through training, and again, we provide TTA to the MDTs and the CACs across the United States. You can build a better trained, you can grow your team to be better trained and trauma-informed in ways to serve families. And also, if the community understands that you're coming to them in a humble way, in a way that acknowledges that they are the experts in their community. They are the experts in their homes, right? We're not the experts in their homes. Those families know and they live it every day. We have to acknowledge that our special set of skills, that that we can bring to the table may be beneficial to the family, but we have to know what they need from us, right? We have to listen to them. We have to tune in and check in with them. And by applying that approach, it's going to increase our connection with the community itself too, right? Like if they realize, hey, you are here, you're legit, like you really want to walk alongside us and help us figure this out. Like how can we work together within the community to be better for these families or address the immediate needs that our families are having. And then we also know that all of those benefits can translate into safer communities, because at the end of the day, that's what we want, right? Safe, protected families and communities and children. So who are some potential partners? Yes, ma'am. Yes, who's
Law enforcement, prosecution, health and welfare, or whatever you call them, your forensic interviewer, your child advocate, your medical resource.
right? Exactly. There's a lot of different people that need to be at the table, and it's. I'm sorry.
And other, because in some tribal communities, we have other musicians that actually work with all those as a networking system.
That's right. Yes, thank you. Yeah, and these are just some conversation starters, because this is generally what you see, but you're absolutely right. Each of the 572 federally recognized tribes and the 200 plus more that are state recognized are diverse and unique and beautiful in their own way, and they do have different operations. So thank you for sharing that. Yes. Is there anything else that anybody would like to add that maybe isn't up here, or that you have one in your community and you think it's really beneficial for them to be at the table? Victim services? Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. She's got the mic, and she's got to, if you guys don't mind raising your hand so the people online can hear. There's one over here. Yeah.
We have a wide variety youth advocacy service, and I think that's beneficial for youth too.
Yeah, that's great. Lived and experienced people, right? That's been my experience too, is just someone across the table from that family who's been in their shoes. Sometimes them offering the same information that we as service providers do, it comes a little bit easier from a family, someone that's been in their shoes. So using youth mentors or peer mentors, yeah, is very helpful. Is there anything else? Okay. CACs, right? They're a big part. They can be a big part of it too. But you know, you can absolutely have a functioning, MDT without a CAC as well. But if there's a CAC there, they need an MDT. So, as an MDT, you can stand alone, and the partnership that CACs and MDTs offer each other is just I can't even put in words the importance that they go hand in hand. And again, it's those professionals that come from an understanding of walking alongside each other to serve the community best. So we talked about breaking down the cylinders of excellence earlier. And it's important to acknowledge that we're not alone in this work. It's hard work. I know, I've done it, 22 years, boots on the ground, started, child treatment worker, foster care certification. I've done every aspect of Indian child welfare that there is out there. I've developed programs, I've diligent search, and it was so interesting that I'm sorry, did you have a question? Oh, okay. Yeah, so it's important to acknowledge that it is hard work, and the amount of energy that we put on ourselves, the stress, the secondary traumatic stress, and it's important that we understand that there's people across the table, that we can reach across the table to be a good community to support the family. And then we know that all the members of the NDT can assist the family in their immediate needs within the crisis that they're facing at that time. And then it also extends beyond joint investigations and interagency coordinated into team decision making. So how do we grow one? We have to start with committed members. An initial meeting, right? That first knock on the door. We have to say, okay, we want to develop this within our community. How can we make this happen? And a mission statement is so important. We talked about the fact that that we have to understand the true drive behind the want to develop an MDT. We need a mission statement. And then we have to develop that protocol. And again, each community is diverse and different, and so they may look similar, but they may be very different as well. And how do we get started? Recruiting the members. We identify those people we talked about earlier, the others as well. Set the parameters of the meetings. Acknowledge that there's not going to be one agency that is sometimes there may be someone that tries to drive something across that need to make sure that we all know our role within the team. And sometimes it's hard to make sure that we have that balance, but that's what's important, is to make sure that there is a balance. We don't want one member of the team to feel they play a larger role than the other members. Shared decision making. And acknowledging those power differentials like we talked about. I know we were talking earlier about just developing or growing those challenging relationships with law enforcement sometimes, or with child welfare services, with behavioral health, with medical, all in our cylinders of excellence. It's a challenge because we're so just in that state of mind. We're just in that that one-track mind. We're staying in our lane, but it's important that we acknowledge that there is different levels of power within the room, but whenever we're at the table, we're all on the same page and we have that one goal, that one mission. To maintain those good working relationships among your team members. Consistent MDT meetings, that's important. That's so valuable. You have to have a set date and time, and they have to happen. That's the challenge whenever you aren't consistent, is that then the people that generally join start to fall off. And then, of course, we need to make sure that all those functions and procedures are documented. Was there anything else that those of you who have been involved in MDTs for a significant amount of time might like to offer? Yes.
I know a while ago when you were talking, it was like you were listing a lot of the professional people, like the law enforcement, but I really feel living on a reservation, being a tribal member, if you can acknowledge or try to build a relationship with grandparents, I think that's just a big part of helping any child or any other adult that's in a situation, because when we're in a situation and we live in an environment that's not a healthy environment, we're not going to tell you, we're not going to talk about it. We're very secretive as Indian people, and it's really hard sometimes for you to build that relationship with grandparents, because sometimes we don't want to tell, or we don't want to talk about our children having such hard times. But to me, you had mentioned a lot of the professional people, but I think it's very important to acknowledge grandparents.
Absolutely, that extended family. Yes, ma'am.
So under ICWA, there's the MDT and the definition of the MDT. And then now that I'm working in developing a CAC center, and their definition of MDT seems a little more, or their focus seems a little different, to where like under ICWA, MDT seems more inclusive, where in the Child Advocacy Center, it seems to be really more of a, and I'm guessing, so I really need everybody's input. It seems to be more forensically focused on getting that interview done so that it holds up somewhere. I don't know where it holds up.
So in order to be an accredited MDT or an accredited CAC, there are certain requirements that you do have to meet that go along with meeting those standards to become accredited. So you're right, MDT teams look different, but if you're specifically to be accredited or to be a CAC MDT, there are some different standards.
I think one thing to remember with multidisciplinary teams is, especially when you're working on a CAC, is it kind of looks that way on one end, but when you look at all of the people that are involved in it, that mental health, the medical, the advocates, when you come into the meeting, it's a really wonderful circle of people who all have different goals, and you come in and you partners buy into this process. And in that buy-in of that process, the most important person in that room is that child and that family, and what you're going to do to help them get through this very traumatic time. So it might seem very forensically driven on one end, but in those meetings and what your goals are, you'll see how wonderful the process is of having a child advocacy center there. But on the MDT side, one of the things that I think is one of the most important things to do to get started is partner buy-in, is everybody coming together to say, I'm going to put the things that I think I have to accomplish aside, and we're going to look at this as a group that's keeping the focus on the most important people in this room, and that's the child that we're serving.
Thank you. And I know the fact that you're not a tribal CAC, but you work so closely with the nation in your area, or the nations in your area, and the connection that you have with them is very intentional, and it's at your leadership to ensure that that takes place. So that's very important, very valuable for those of you CACs that are not tribally developed or not driven by tribes, to be intentional in your approach to walking along tribes and make sure that they're at the table.
One thing that I think is really important and I've noticed is very important is having an agenda for your meetings. A lot of times it's a very stressful environment. You're talking about a lot of painful things. You're talking about, children with trauma, and it's easy to get carried away and it's easy to focus on just one particular case, but it's important to focus on all of them. So having an agenda is a really good way to make sure that you don't miss anybody and nobody falls through the cracks. And it's also important to have a confidentiality policy created, because reservations, people talk, and it's really important that the family and the children are respected and that things that are discussed in their forensic interviews don't come out.
Thank you for that. Yes, it's very important and very valuable to ensure that the confidentiality stays within the team.
Thanks. One of the things on how you get started, one thing that's really important is an interagency agreement to be signed by law enforcement, your district attorney's office, counselors, all of those 6 components. And it's really best practice, too, to have your district attorney be present at all times, because they're the ones that are really supposed to be leading the meetings. Now, that is non-tribal,
Right.
so I'm not really sure how that works being in tribal, but if you can have them there either way, that's even better.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, and it's important to acknowledge, too, that state CACs and tribal CACs will have different partners at the table and different, due to their tribal codes, whatever their tribal code says are the ones who need to be at the table for those MBTs. So we were just having that conversation about making sure if you're a tribal CAC that sometimes your tribal codes need to be revamped, and make sure to include all of the partners too. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. Confidentiality policies. We just talked about that. Conflict resolution practices, because although we're at the same table, some of us may have a different opinion of what needs to take place. So it's important that we acknowledge that we might not all be on the same page at the same time. Consistent professional development. We have to make sure that we're very well aware of best practice when engaging with our families. And we can learn that across the table from our partners, or we can extend the hand to the community partners whenever you're doing training. If you bring people in to do a training, invite anyone who might possibly engage with your agency and with your organization. Then continuous quality improvement, because yes, ma'am.
On that professional development, I wanted to mention, years back, I used to be a caseworker for Indian Child Welfare Act, and I was really nervous because being Native, living on an Indian reservation, when they asked me to take that position, I thought, there's just no way I could do it because these are my relatives, and I can't see some child, my cousin or nephew or somebody, yanked out of their homes. But they told me I had a foot in the door. But what I learned as being a caseworker, we were educating the justice system, we were educating the courts. And that was frightening for me. But as being Native, you have to be able to speak up and not be afraid to tell them. They knew, they had read the Indian Child Welfare Act, so they understood it, they knew it, but they didn't live it like we live it as tribal people. And so that was really hard, but it made me a stronger woman after I stopped being so shaky And, but the judges really were very appreciative. They really were appreciative. A lot of them were very, very good, acknowledged the tribal people, and that was great to work with some of those judges. But some of those judges really gave me a hard time because they had other business to attend to, it seems. So it was difficult, but it was challenging, but yet it was rewarding. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Thank you for that. Sometimes it's important that you share your opinion even when your voice quivers. I know, yeah. Been there, done that. I remember the first 3 years, whenever I started in 1999, working at Indian Child Welfare, I took FCWA, the Federal Indian Child Welfare Act, with me. I took the Oklahoma Indian Child Welfare Act with me, and I took DHS policy on working with Indian children with me in a binder everywhere I went. Yeah, because they were like, we can't do that, and I said, yeah, you can. It says it right here. So yeah, I know it's challenging, but definitely beneficial, because at the end of the day, it's about keeping our children, right, connected. Yeah. Anyone else? And we have to also ensure that we're using the four R's when we're thinking about a trauma-informed approach to working at this table or working with the family, and that we need to realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand potential paths for recovery for our families. We need to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in youth, individuals, family, and the community, and respond to fully integrating knowledge about trauma into our policies, into our procedures, and into our practices. Absolutely. We need to acknowledge that each of our communities is different, and there's a different way to engage within our families, and that needs to be reflective in our policies and procedures. And then we also need to actively resist re-traumatizing our families or the people that we have in front of us, the children. And how are we cultivating that? We have to understand that trauma affects the child and the family, and we have to address the needs of the family as a whole. If we're just independently working with the child alone, and we haven't addressed the needs of mom and dad, whenever the child goes home, mom and dad still have that trauma that they have to deal with themselves too. So in order for us to really do best practice and ensure for the entire family to heal, the entire family has to heal. Training on trauma is vital. We need to talk about trauma in the developing child, what trauma does to the brain, how it affects the way a developing child, and just from that moment on, the new way that they see the world through that trauma that's affected them. And the impacts of historical trauma on families today, the ripple effects that we continue to see in our communities. And then again, like I said, the importance of addressing parent trauma. Yes, ma'am, we have a question.
So they've shown
She's got
They've also shown that trauma can also start inside the womb. So if there's any kind of abuse towards the mother while she is pregnant, it affects the development of the child while they're inside the womb too, and the connections for the neurotransmitters.
absolutely. Epigenetics, yes, absolutely. Okay. Okay.
Sorry, you didn't see me when you were a few slides back, but on this slide where you're talking about the conflict resolution and such, just sharing that I work with 5 tribes in Upper Michigan, and of course, small communities, as you were sharing, and people, everyone knowing everyone. So one of the key things too at the beginning of our meetings, if there is a partner, someone who is working in one of those MDT partner positions, and this child is related, or there's some kind of connection to the family, right away it's told, and they recuse themselves from that MDT meeting, and try to replace them with someone that might be in a position similar, or sometimes moving forward without them, and just making sure, because of the fact that that could be a conflict.
Right, yeah. Okay. There are those challenges whenever we work within tribal communities, the connections, the relatives that we have. I'm from one of the larger tribes in the United States, and so even though it's one of the largest tribes, we still have a lot of connections. Like you can't walk across or walk through the mall or walk through Walmart with running into 4 or 5 of my cousins. So, yeah.
Yes, I had a question or wondering if there's even more resources on the conflict resolution, because one of the challenges that, because I come from a smaller community, we're trying to join in, we're tribal, but we're also joining in to the county, and everybody's coming in at a different level. And we noticed that people on the team have a different level of understanding. We're not coming, there's not a standard set like, oh, you should have this training, or you should know this, or you should have this type of experience. And a lot of people are speaking from experience, but things are changing in the community, especially with racial equity and things like that. How do you, or could you recommend resources to deal with those types of things?
Absolutely. So we have resources available not only on our website, but then also too, we can connect you to other. Did you say was it a tribal CIC or a state CIC?
We're actually it's actually a county, and we're a multidisciplinary. Well, they have a multidisciplinary team. We were funded and became advocates, and we joined the team. And our advocacy is like highly in demand because there's actually 7 tribes where we're at. But there's just a lot of, like we come to trainings like so, and we bring all this information back. And as you're saying, we're carrying around these binders where we're like, oh no, you can do this. Oh no, this can be done. Or, oh no, you don't have to say this, or this is not what should happen. But because we are lacking in the experience department, it's a challenge. So I was just wondering, are there more resources or trainings or things that we can encourage people to?
Absolutely. Again, if you'd like to visit after, I'd love to have a conversation. But yeah, through our website, and then also we have community partners across the United States, and she might be able to answer your question too. She's been here, she's been doing this line of work for just a minute.
One thing when you were talking about that might be beneficial, because there are so many different trainings around the country, but if you can send one of your advocates who's designated as your MDT facilitator, and they're maybe given those specialized training to help navigate those tricky moments that you have when your team is developing. On one of the MDTs I was on, we would frequently say it takes 100 light, easy conversations to have that one courageous conversation, and that's the truth. You have to do that. So having that facilitator who can kind of mediate that is helpful. Another thing we found with an MDT that I was on is there were 2 books that we read, and one was Crucial Conversations.
Oh.
And it really, really helped, because sometimes we forget with an MDT, we all think we should be seeing and having the same opinions all the time, but the fact of the matter is, by virtue of the jobs we have, we're going to butt up against each other. And that is actually in the best interest of the child and their family, because then we have different viewpoints that we're looking at. So a strong facilitator who's really well trained is incredibly helpful.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else? So we talked a little bit too about acknowledging that historical trauma is affecting today in our communities, it affects the people within our communities today. But we also want to make sure that we talk about what that looks like, what it is. And Maria Yellowhorse Braypart, she was the first person to coin the term historical trauma as it pertains to indigenous peoples of the United States or of North America. She was doing research on the Holocaust and what that looked like for the Jews, and how those effects were prevalent in their lives today, or whenever she did started this research. I think it was the late 90s, excuse me. And so part of her definition was the cumulative psychological wounding across generations, including the lifespan which emanates from massive group trauma, and a few other elements that are specific to historical trauma is that a lot of times they call it like a soul wound. In one of the research studies that I read, there's a woman that talks about she has felt this ache in her heart since she was a child growing up, and she didn't know what it was, but it was a soul wound. She'd hoped to heal from it, but she'd come to realize as an adult it was the effects that historical trauma played in her life on a daily basis. And then again, that it's shared by a group of people, and it's specific to a group identity. It has genocidal, ethnocidal intent, and it spans multiple generations. So some examples of historical trauma are, of course, genocide, disease, starvation, forced migration, relocation, or enslavement. And I want to acknowledge, too, that these may look different from community to community, but these are just some, there are some that are fairly similar across the board, and these are some of those. Of course, reservations, boarding schools, we'll talk more about that in a little bit, broken treaties, criminalization of spirituality. Does anybody know when the American Indian Religious Freedoms Act was enacted? 78, yeah. Less than 45 years ago. Less than 45 years ago, we were not able to openly practice our ceremonies or our way of life without being criminalized for it. Yeah, less than 45 years ago. This is relevant today. And then the loss of our children. I also want to talk a little bit about the challenges that we see on our reservations or within our communities when it comes to acts of violence. And I'm not sure if I know that VAWA is so important to our nations, and it's because the vast majority of, I think it's about 82% of the acts of violence that occur to our Native men and Native women are actually interracial acts of violence. There's a big misconception that the vast majority of those are coming from, the acts of violence are coming from those that are not Native. They're not our population. There's only about 30% of the acts of violence committed to other American Indians on American Indians. So the vast majority of that is committed by other people outside of our communities. So whenever we talk about the removal of our children through the boarding school system, these handcuffs get me every time. These are actual handcuffs that were used to forcibly remove children as young as 3 and 4 years old, forcibly removed them and sent them to residential schools, where everything that those the superintendents or the teachers or the matrons, their only intent was to, quote, kill the Indian and save the man. Their intent was to remove, kill, let all that is Indian within you die. So they forcibly removed our children, took them away from communal child upbringing. And of course, whenever our children were gone, our community suffered because we lost those valuable members of our community and the role that they play to keep us whole. So some of the consequences of those, of course, are the ineffective or destructive parenting. So if you've grown up in a boarding school system from the time you were 4 years old until you're 19, 20 years old, and you get out, and you've not once seen anyone or any adult have a positive interaction or parent-child interaction, or had seen two adults communicate in a way that if there's adversity, they've never seen them overcome adversity, how can you then expect them to have any type of role model to see positive parenting? They've only seen what's been taught to them, and we know that our children in those residential schools were abused in every sense of the word. So that's how, that was their norm. And so those are some of the consequences. And then insensitivity to the child's needs, because as children, they themselves had no one that was sensitive to their needs. Weak spiritual foundations, because again, they were taught how they grew, how they learned in their communities. Everything they knew to be true was bad. and in some cases referred to as devil worshiping. So that left us with weak ethnic identities. I always like to quote this because it talks about our resilience, our ability within our tribal communities to maintain optimism during adversity. We talk about it's related to it's our connection to spirituality, it's our compassion for others, empathy, humor, friendships, familial and community strengths. That's how we've been able to survive for so long, survive, adapt, prosper, excel. So whenever we talk about acknowledging that is relevant within our communities today, then how do we then in turn bring that to the MDT and have that acknowledged and understand that because of these interactions and the trauma that we've felt as peoples, how do we translate that into best practice to serve those families? So we have to lean into the team. We have to lean in and we have to be trained. We have to have an understanding. We have to acknowledge that this happened. We have to want to support families to move and go forward and to heal. We talked earlier about the importance of acknowledging or complying with tribal code. We have to comply with tribal code if you're a tribal CAC, whatever that looks like. If you're a state CAC, we have to make sure that we're in compliance there as well. And especially sometimes, there are some tribal codes that don't even speak to MDT teams or speak to the communities or the people that they serve within their reservation or wherever they are. So we talked a little bit earlier about there is some time to enhance tribal code, and that might be one of the times to bring it to the table. We need to make sure that the investigations are timely, and we know that this is going to be a traumatic time for the child, the victim, and the family itself too. We have to make sure that we're supporting them and providing and acknowledging and getting their immediate needs met. And then we know that effective teamwork can prevent the further trauma. And then at the end of the day, bring those who harm them to justice. So what do culturally responsive MDT teams look like? We have to have tribal representation at the table. They have to be there. We have to acknowledge the culture and the diversity within those nations and each community that we work with, because there may be some that walk alongside multiple nations and not just one. So it's acknowledging and being humble in your approach and coming forward with cultural humility, acknowledging that I'm not the expert here. I do not know what is specific to you, what your traditional child rearing practices are. Help me learn. How can I help you? We have to acknowledge that each of those cultures may look different. We talked about historical trauma, and we talked about the need for family input. Grandmas, everybody needs to be at the table. We need to make sure that we're serving this family all together. Yes, sir.
Thank you. You were mentioning and talking about trauma to the family and to the child, the direct trauma, and I don't disagree with that. But I think it's also worth pointing out that that vicarious trauma that the MDT members, feel and go through is something that should also be recognized and plans put in place to be able to have a safe way for the team members to be able to express and see their way through that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for adding that. Yes, we need to make sure that we're meeting our needs as service providers, as helpers. Definitely. Thank you. Yeah. And then we talked about family advocates too, making sure that they can provide those direct services to the child and to the family. We've talked a few times about cultural humility. We need to know that everyone is on the spectrum of what it is to be a citizen of their nation. There are some that may have their own view as to, there are some communities that are very traditional, there are some communities that attend church often, so it's important that we acknowledge that family, whatever their connection to their tribe or however they represent it, is theirs and theirs alone, and it's our job to support that, whatever it is. We need to have that respect for others. Again, we have to be open-minded. We have to come to the table and acknowledge that what I have done, what I did yesterday with the other family, may not work at all today. So how can I serve you? How can we get to where we need to be to help this family? And then we need to entertain hypotheses instead of drawing conclusions. I know I've been guilty of that before, walking alongside a family, and you've been here, done there, been there with them, and you just think, oh gosh, this isn't going to work. But I have to change that mindset. And we know that trauma-informed care, it's not like there's not an A to Z manual that we can hand you and you'd say, if this happens, you do this. If this happens, you do this. It's about a shift in your mindset. It's the way you approach and engage with families. It's about taking a step back and being humble and acknowledging that I cannot bring my bias to this table. I have to serve them in a way that's healthy and helpful to them. So how do we align our policies and practices with our culture and traditions? We need to make sure that we take into consideration the way that a community comes together to assist a family in need. And within one community, it may look different than the next community, or within a non-Indian community, it may look different than an indigenous community. So we have to find out what that looks like in the area that you serve. Find out what is working there, what should work there. If it's not working, why isn't it working? What can we do to make it work? Who do we need at the table? How can we have those connections? And what are their traditional teachings around healing? That's important to acknowledge too, that some of them are maybe challenged by engaging in some of the services because they have a Western lens, because they come from Western science. And maybe some of our families are more traditional and would rather have ceremonies as a way to help them heal. And then we know about protective factors. We know relationships are is one of the most significant protective factor in being resilient as a child, is having a positive relationship with one individual. And it doesn't have to be mom or dad, it can be grandma, it can be coach, it can be anyone, but that relationship has to be honest. The adult has to tell the child, has to do what they're going to do whenever they say they're going to do it. It has to be someone that the child can believe in and is there for them. Protective factors, and also connection to culture is a protective factor. Knowing those traditional ways of healing, or even just the rites of passage, right? And being able to engage in that. And I have a great, one of the CACs that we worked with, I don't see him in the room, but he talked about there was a child, and she came in one of her most vulnerable moments in her life, and she needed help, and she was in one of their shelters, and she became a woman, and she was scared and sad because she knew what it looked like in her community, and she didn't feel like she was just going to be able to have that ceremony where she was. But those members of the shelter were very respectful of that, and they reached out to members of the community, and they were able to provide her with what she needed in that moment, and that was amazing. Whenever he told that story, it was great. We just all got goosebumps. But that's about being a community partner and supporting that young individual in their time of need. We need to seek guidance from tribal leaders and wisdom keepers, and again, acknowledge the value of traditional healing practices. And we know that each family comes with their own strengths. We need to lead with that strengths-based approach, not just dinging them with everything negative as soon as they walk through the door. I have seen it, you guys. I know it to be true. Whenever you give a family that little glimmer of hope, I have seen them. I've seen it connect, and they will move mountains. They will do what they need to do to make sure that they correct those conditions to get their child back. Just giving families hope. And each team needs to be the one to develop their own policies and practices. And again, if you're working closely with a nation, it's very valuable to reach out to them to make sure that you are including them at the table. You, of course, would never want to do anything that would be disrespectful to them in any way. and make sure that it's seen. We talk about, whenever we're building CACs, we talked about safety, right? We talk about, and who is the one who determines safety in your space? Are you, as the director of the CAC or the MDT lead, are you the one who determines the safety? Or is it the people that walk through the door? If they don't feel safe, they're the ones. And it's important that we acknowledge that just something as simple as walking through the room and there's a picture on the wall of someone who looks like them. Like that, they think, oh, I belong here. There's people on the wall that look like me. Little things like that. Then, of course, self-assessment. We were talking about continuing quality improvement earlier, before the conversation took place, but in order for us to sincerely serve the families in a way that is best practice and trauma-informed, we have to get their input. We have to hear from them. What are we doing wrong? What can we do differently? We have to be open and listen to them and we have to be honest, too. We have to take a good, deep look at ourselves. We have to know that we can't always be doing everything 100%. We're not always doing everything right, and it's so valuable to hear that outside evaluation and data collection with our families. And it's important, too, with those nations, if they're at the table, that they own their data. Their data is theirs. It's not a university. It's not someone else's. It's important that the tribes have a voice in the families they serve and in the data. So we know coordinated response leads to better outcomes, right? Working together helps us serve those families in the best way that we can. Offering a team strategy to victim services ensures a holistic approach to the child victim and their family. So, any questions? I know we pretty much talked them out as they came up, so yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Where do you feel like the referral for the victim or the families should primarily come from? I think that's one of our biggest issues that we have with our MDT. We just have the one silo program that family services, who's often referring families for MDT or medical. But I've seen other MDTs and it comes from the prosecutor's office. I'm just wondering how other people get their referrals for who they're going to MDT. That's my question.
Yeah. Does anybody would you guys like to, Deanna or Kimber? Yeah. Those of that do the boots on the ground, I'm going to offer this to them because they're the ones that can provide you with that immediate insight. Yeah, there's two right here, this one and this one, that can answer those questions.
We're the facilitator for our MDT, so we actually send an email out a few days ahead of time to FBI, law enforcement, prosecutor, CPS, those different entities, and say if you have anybody to add to the agenda, go ahead and send it over, and then we leave a little space at the bottom and just say, hey, if there's a last minute. Getting referrals to the CAC typically comes in through law enforcement. Sometimes it comes in through CPS, but then we kind of redirect it, and that's something we're new at the CAC I'm at. We're still developing, so that nearly always comes through law enforcement, and when it doesn't, we redirect it that way. So we're meeting statute. Is that? Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I'm right in front of you. We send out the email a week ahead of time and ask for the referrals to be sent to one person who creates the agenda. We have a confidentiality thing, so we don't send it out in an email. But like we just had it for this last week and nobody emails. So that's the issue, is we're not getting, we're sending that out. I'm just wondering how we can get our partners more engaged. I like the interagency agreement, and that's something I think we need to do, but I'm looking for other ideas.
Part of that is what we have in our MDT agreement, and we do have a protocol that they all sign off on. And then sometimes what I've done too is I just march myself on over to that office and I'm like, hey, buddy, haven't been seeing you sign up lately. What's going on? And it works really well because then sometimes they just need us to hold their hand and remind them that they got to sign the sheet.
Okay. I was just asking if we get a copy of the interagency agreement to see what that looks like, a template.
Yes. Yeah, we have some too.
The other mic?
We're all technology challenges. I think the question I would have for you, the lady that asked that, is are you a freestanding MDT? Are you connected to a CAC?
She's the social services manager. Not connected to a CAC.
Okay.
Interested in becoming a tribal CAC.
Oh, great. So I think there's a couple of things. If you're in Oklahoma, we have freestanding multidisciplinary teams that they can operate individually outside of a CAC. And their process is kind of the same way. All the partner agencies, there's a lead agency. That lead agency is saying, what cases do we want to staff this month, and sends them out to the partners through whatever protocol or process that they've determined is best for their team. Our child advocacy centers, we're the lead agency for 2 counties. And so what we do is all the cases that we see, we are automatically. We primarily get referrals from our Department of Human Services and law enforcement and tribal and FBI. So we get referrals from all of them. And then those will go on our agenda to be staffed at our MDT meeting. It's really protocol driven. And that's why the CACs are so amazing to me, because we have the National Children's Alliance that determines these CAC standards, and then those standards are adaptive to your community. So whether you're a urban center or a rural center, you can make those standards. Your team can develop standards to meet what you do where you're at.
Go ahead, in the back.
Oh, I'm thinking that this might be helpful. I'm a federal tribal victim assistance specialist, and so with the tribes up in Upper Michigan, they have monthly MDT meetings. One of the tribes, the facilitator is out of the Family Services Department, Child Welfare. It's the prosecutor's office that sends out the agenda and the reminders, and we do monthly meetings. They start out with the federal cases, and then we leave, and they continue on with their tribal cases. It's totally separate from their Indian welfare, child welfare MDTs. I just want to make sure that you understand that. So 2 different meetings they have, but we are part of that monthly. And then we will be invited to emergency MDTs when there, is an urgent case that comes through. And so they are the lead bringing all those partners in. But I will say that it really meeting monthly, and even sometimes there isn't a case, but we still meet. We review protocol. We talk together. We look at upcoming trainings or things that are needed. And it just really keeps everyone feeling like a team. And seems to work very well. I don't know if that's helpful.
Thank you for that. Did you have a question?
Yes, we are a very small tribe. We do not have an MDT. We do not have a nearby CAC. Where do we start?
That's a great question. I would love to set up a conversation with you. We could have a conversation at Zoom, maybe in the coming weeks, so we could talk about. You have to start laying that foundation. You've got to recruit the team members. You've got to make sure that you have support within your tribal administration, because time you take on a new project, it's a challenge, and you have to have their support to do it as well. So we have kind of like, we're actually doing a decision-making tree model. We're developing it as we speak. So yeah, I'd love to have that conversation if you'd like to.
Okay, yeah, sounds just as difficult as I imagined.
Yeah. And there's a couple in the pink right behind. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes, so what I've noticed that really worked for our tribe and our MDT meetings is our facilitator just gives us a list of all of the hotline calls that have come in for that month. We go through that list, even if, Child and Family Services says that does not meet definitions, we still discuss it. We get it on our, on our eyes, and that's when, it kind of is those things that maybe Child and Family Services doesn't consider it, a priority, but at least the tribe's aware of it, and we can send PD to go investigate further or something like that. So that's how we do it, is just every, hotline call that comes in, it gets discussed in our monthlies, and it really works for us.
Awesome, thanks for sharing that, that's great.
I guess I'm just really confused on what we're doing. I work for a victim services program. Our tribe has a social service program, but, sometimes we're dealing kind of cases that kind of intersect. And then there's issues of confidentiality at times.
Right.
And then there's times when we report child abuse only for the cases to come back to us, when it should be social services, because social services can mandate things. We can't.
And I want to offer this too. I know that different tribes have different terms for social services versus Indian child welfare. So the two nations that I worked at, their social services was different than the Indian child welfare. Like their social services was like TANF and burial. So whenever you say social services, is that their Indian child welfare?
It's everything.
Oh.
It's non-IGA too. No, I get confused because there's cases that get referred to us when it seems like it would be social services.
Mm-hmm. And that just sounds like potentially a conversation between you and your social services about what those parameters are, what they look like, and why.
I think part of the problem is that I have a staff member who used to work in social services, so she knows what should be coming our way and what shouldn't be coming our way. So when there was a MDT meeting and she was invited, when she started voicing her concerns, then we were disinvited.
Oh. Well, that power in the room, right?
So I don't know how.
Or a differential.
Yeah, it's just kind of it's only in I guess it's human services. There's only 2 people in there.
And I think maybe what might help that is if you have that mission statement and those protocols and those policies and procedures, and so if this happens in this case, we'll be at the table, or if this doesn't, if there's reason, we shouldn't be at every table, and maybe, like I said, I'm not really sure what the dynamic looks like in your nation, but I can give you my information too, and if you'd like to have a call, I'd be happy to do that as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I was just going to add to the piece I didn't share with you that in Upper Michigan, there are 3 fairly new CACs there, so the tribes can do a referral there for the forensic interview and such. Of course, our FBI CAFIs that we do bring in, and they'll utilize the CAC facility or FBI location. But we also have 2 tribes that are, one that has already the facility and everything is ready to start and have their own CAC facility right there, and a second one that's in process. And that's all been part of that teamwork from those MDT meetings and working to grow and looking for the grants and finding the people that are able to assist with getting those up and running. And they have been working with the Michigan CAC and the national and the accreditation pieces of it all. But so we do finally have that. We have 2 SANE nurses in the whole Upper Michigan.
Wow.
So that's the other tough piece. So we do have a nonprofit that started called Trace Holistics, who's trying to work on a traveling group of SANE nurses that would then be able to go as needed across Upper Michigan. It's a very rural area, if you're familiar with it.
Wow. Thanks for sharing. Thanks. Anyone else? If not, well, thank you guys for coming this afternoon. Or was there?
So kind of to answer the question about doing the where to start on your MDT, kind of identifying your funding source, which VOCA and OBC is really good, because when you start encompassing your partners, that's one of the questions they're gonna ask is who is funding, because your MDT will be able to, with those funds, can provide trainings like going to crimes against children, going to things like this. So that's really important to really identify your funding source first, if that's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you guys. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.